I would like to share a particular scripture passage which has come to mean a lot to me over the years, and it's one that I believe you will already be familiar with. Hebrews chapter 9. For this reason Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, now that he has died as a ransom to set them free. And you and I are familiar with this word ransom. I mean, it's a payment made to secure the release of someone. And officially today we don't pay ransoms to free kidnapped people, although I'm sure behind the scenes it happens. Those of you here who have been around a few years will remember that back in the 70s, it was a bit of a heyday for kidnapping. It seems that every terrorist group decided that this was a new form of fundraising. And there were some very famous ones, such as, for example, the Bourne brothers. They were grain traders from Argentina. And their captors demanded a fairly high price, $60 million, or roughly 300 million equivalent today. And they were that valuable to their grain company that 60 million was paid, and they were released and went on with their lives. But of course, that type of a scenario for making money isn't new even to the last 100 or 200 years. If you go back to Bible days, being kidnapped and requiring a ransom was not uncommon. And the more important you were, the more that ransom would be. One of the most famous ones was Julius Caesar in 75 BC. At this time, he was a practicing lawyer. He hadn't come to political power as yet. And as he was out on a business trip, a group of pirates grabbed him and his men and held them for ransom and asked the figure what they thought was going to be a high figure. They said, "We want 20 talents of silver." And Julius Caesar laughed at them and said, "What? I'm only worth 20 talents of silver?" He said, "I demand you ask 50 talents for me." So they did, and he sent his men around and they found the 50 talents. The whole time Julius Caesar was there, he just bossed them around like he was the leader and just mercilessly subjected them to his control. And they just took it thinking he was perhaps a little bit simple. And he kept on saying to them, "You know, when you release me, I'm coming back to grab you and crucify you." And they just laughed at him. But of course, after paying the 50 talents, he did come back and grab them and crucify them. Most of the time, people aren't unlucky enough to be captured and kidnapped more than once. Although there was a particular gentleman, Charles Lockwood, he was an executive in Argentina. And in 1973, he was kidnapped, and the particular group involved asked for $2 million. And so that was paid. And as they were letting him go, they said to him, "It's okay, you're going to be safe now. We never squeezed the same lemon twice." But 3 years later, they must have run short of money. And they came back and kidnapped the same guy again. And this time they said, "We want $10 million, which was paid, and he duly shifted out of Argentina to avoid a third occasion. But when I heard his story, I realized in some ways that was a little bit like the Old Testament sacrifices. Because you see, one lamb was never enough. Charles Lockwood couldn't have turned round to his captors the second time and say, "Hey guys, you've made a mistake. I actually don't have to pay the money because I paid it last time." Their response would have been, "If you want to live, you'll pay it again." And in the Old Testament sanctuary services, there was this ongoing, if I erred today and brought my lamb and sacrificed that so that that blood covers my sin. It wouldn't do me in another 3 months to say to the priest, hey, I don't have to come this time. I did this already. It just wasn't enough. And so we have this text from Hebrews. Every priest stands daily ministering and offering time after time the same sacrifices which can never take away sins, because one lamb was never enough. That sacrifice was not enough the next time. And so Hebrews adds to the theme and says, for the law, having only a shadow of the good things to come. Now, it's possible you and I may look at that text differently from the original readers, because you and I don't actually put great value on a shadow. But in the day this was written, shadows were actually considered pretty important by nearly every culture that you went to. The Egyptians, for instance, believe your shadow was a part of who you were as a person. So some of the pharaohs that died actually had put in the tomb a shadow box, and that was for their shadow to come and inhabit, so that in the afterlife they weren't separated from that shadow. In Greece, for example, the people were known to dedicate their shadows to the god that they worshipped, and there was a shadow dedication ceremony. Even the shadows of inanimate objects were worshipped. So, for example, the shadow of a temple, that was sacred. You wouldn't walk on that. It was something that was to be venerated. So it wasn't minimizing the system by saying it was a shadow. It was symbolizing that this was actually important, but it represented something else that was even more real, because there's something about a shadow which isn't enough. I mean, imagine that we invited you to enter into a new friendship, a relationship with someone, and the only rules were that you weren't allowed to see them. You could only see the shadow, and you could talk to the shadow. So over a period of weeks, you look at the shadow and you talk to it and you commune and you can hear it. But all the while you're wondering, I wonder what they really look like. And probably your mind would start to create this picture of what you think the reality of the shadow really is. And perhaps that one day comes when you actually get to view the actual face of this shadow that you've been communing with, only to be totally surprised that what you see is so different from what you expected. I think that's where I hear the wonder in John's voice, because he gets, after a period of time, after all these hundreds of years, to meet the shadow of things to come as it turns into reality. 1 John 1:1, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at, and our hands have touched, this we proclaim concerning the word of God. And I can just hear the wonder. I've met the real. And the real is love. And the real is compassionate. And the shadow had nothing on what the real really is. And as I contemplate it, I wonder how many Christians are still in contact with the shadow and haven't as yet met personally the flesh and blood, the relationship that Christ offers us that's real. Hebrews goes on, but having offered for all time one sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God. For by one sacrifice he has made perfect for all time, continuously, those who are being made holy or who are being purified. So now at this moment, all these millions of sacrifices have pointed to this one time And now it's come because the ransom has been paid once for all. And I don't have to go and sacrifice another lamb because I have this once for all ransom that's been paid for my life. And as I contemplate this idea of the ransom paid for my life and the value of it, I mean, we know that a ransom paid is in proportion to the value or the worth of the person being held. So how do I see my worth in relation to that ransom being paid? And as I've thought about it, there are just two things I'd like to share with you this morning. And they are just simply two personal things, as in, this is how that impacts me personally. This is what it really means to me as an individual. And the first of the two is this. Hebrews 2:9, but we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels, now crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. I thought, what's the original word for taste death? And I found that literally translated it means to try the flavor, to partake of the flavor, to experience. So Christ tries the flavor of death on behalf of everyone. And when I think about flavors and the sorts of flavors I like and don't like, they did this interesting large survey in the UK to find out what are the 10 most hated foods that people hate to partake the flavor of. And there they are. You might look at them and say, well, actually, some of them there I quite like. I have no idea how tofu made it up there because tofu is beautiful. And olives and licorice, wow, there's some... But at least for the majority of people, they are the foods that they... I got interested, so what about the vegetables? What are the ones that most people hate partaking of the flavour of? And there's the top 10. And again, I can see, like you probably can see some things up there that you... I agree with the parsnip. I got no problem with that. Actually, the rest are pretty good. What blew me away, though, is there's one food that should be on that list. I'm really glad we think alike. I stumbled across this article the other day, and it actually was listing all the health benefits of it. But I just want to tell you, it's fake news. It's not true. But it does take me back to my childhood because Mum used to like boiling up Brussels sprouts. And I'd find a couple on my plate. I don't know what it is about mothers who will want to make you eat those things you don't want. And I remember them just sitting there knowing it's no dessert till I've got rid of those two little green things on my plate. And Mum starts to pot around in the kitchen, and this is my dad's chance. And he quietly slides the Brussels sprouts onto his plate and winks at me. And he didn't like them either. But he would do that for me. And then I think of what Christ did. Who enjoys the flavor of death? How could that be palatable to anyone? And yet Christ looks at me and says, you are of such worth. Living eternity without you in my presence doesn't fill my heart with joy. And so I'm going to taste that death for you. I'm going to take what's on your plate. I'm going to put it on mine. And to me, that tells me that even if this world doesn't think I'm worthy, God does. And to me, that means the world. So that by the grace of God, he might taste the flavor of death for everyone. There's a text in 2 Corinthians 5:21, and I haven't put it on the screen, but I'd encourage you to go home and look it up and just think about it. You're already familiar with it. But I don't know whether we've plumbed the depths of this text yet. It says this: He made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. Wow, what a trade. I'm condemned to death. I'm ransomed. I get his gifts in his life. So that's the first thing that means a lot to me. But one more. And this one here also comes from Hebrews. And it's Hebrews 2 verse 11. Both the one who makes men holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. You know, if it was just that my ransom was paid, wouldn't that be enough? That would be more than what I deserve or expect. But God goes that extra step and says, you're actually not just ransomed, you're family. I don't just set you free, I adopt you. And I think that's a phenomenal concept. You know, back in the Roman days, you could be born or grow into a number of different social levels. Up the very top, if you wanted to be one of the imperial ruling class, pretty hard to get there unless you were born into the right family, you know, very wealthy, strong political connections. The senators, pretty much a wealth thing, depending how much wealth you had. So you could work your way up into it, and you were signified by your robe had this purple stripe down it, and you had a silver half-crescent moon on your sandal. So everywhere you went, people knew that that's what you were. The equestrians had slightly less money. You could aspire to senatorial class, but you'd have to get pretty wealthy. But there were some privileges. So if you went to war and got conscripted into the army, you got given a horse, and hence the term equestrian. So still a good place to be. The commoners, still fairly good because you came under Roman law and there were certain things people couldn't do to you without a just trial. So it was still not a bad place to be. Coming to the next category, the freed people. Not quite the same class as a commoner, but better than being a slave. But some of the rules still didn't apply to you because you used to be a slave. And then we come to the very last category, and this is the non-people category. And they had a particular word for slaves, and it was called instrumentum vocale, a tool that speaks. And you were at the mercy of your master for any whim, pleasure that they desired. You were to be bought, sold. You were to be severely punished. And sometimes in the large places where there were thousands of slaves, they would kill mercilessly a few, as an example, to the many. But you know, every now and again, something of great wonder happened. And a master would have a child that they became particularly attached to. And they were able to adopt them into their family. And when they did, there were three things that child would get. They would inherit the master's wealth, the master's name, and the master's religion. And suddenly they went from being an instrumentum vocale to a very important person that people would listen to and take notice of and had freedom and choice. But what was amazing, that if that happened, that child was often given the option not just to come themselves, but to look around at their peers and to choose one or two other children to come and be a co-adopted with them so that they weren't just on their own. So often it was a group of them that would come up. And you just imagine if it was a friend of yours who was going to be adopted and they turn around to you and go, hey, You want to come too? You want to come be a part of this family too? Imagine that feeling. One day you're a slave, the next day. And as I read that, I suddenly realized that Jesus' words in this particular text would have made such sense to the people that were around them. He says, so if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. He's saying, I'm the heir. I'm actually the heir, and I'm turning to you in your condition and going, come and be adopted. Come and be part of my family. I think that's incredibly special. Where along the journey do you and I lose the wonder of it all? That it becomes the norm. That we cease to be excited by the fact that you and I have been adopted into this incredible heavenly family. I guess even in more modern times, there's examples of this happening. I don't know if any of you have come across, actually this text here first. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Now, if we are children, then we are heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. Have any of you heard the story of this lady here? She was born in a little country that in that time was West Nigeria, southwest Nigeria. And just to the west of her was the kingdom of Dahomey, which is present-day Benin. And the king of that country decided to send some raiding parties to where this little girl lived. And in the process, her parents are killed and she is captured. And she is kept alive for the purpose of a sacrifice, a human sacrifice. And while she is waiting, there is a trader, an Englishman by the name of Frederick Forbes. And he's trading with this king, and he finds out about this girl and about her destiny. And he can't allow it to happen, so he comes up with a scheme, and he says to the king, Gezo, look, how about we give a gift, you and I, a really precious gift to Queen Victoria in England. She would so appreciate it. And this girl would just be perfect. And eventually he agrees to it. And so she jumps on the boat, and the boat was HMS, let's come back to her name, HMS Bonita. So that becomes her last name. And as she meets Queen Victoria for the first time and converses with her, Queen Victoria is absolutely amazed at the high intelligence of this little girl and adopts her as a goddaughter and pays for the education and allows her to go to some of the best schools. And in the end, she marries a wealthy sea captain and lives this life so far different from what her destiny was. Adopted into royal families is what you and I have. You know, recently I came across this really old book. It was written back in the middle 1800s, and it's called The Kidnapped and the Redeemed. And it's the story of the Still family. They were working in a cotton plantation down in the south as slaves. There was Mum and Dad, and there were two boys, Levin and Peter, two girls, Kitty and Keturah. And Dad was restless. He could not bear to remain alive and to remain a slave any longer. And so he talks to his master, and his master says, well, if you come in after work, your usual working hours, and you work a bit extra, you can earn some money and you can save up and purchase your freedom. Always a risk, because sometimes they would earn the money and then the master would take off with it, but he risked it. And after a period of years, he was able to buy his freedom, but didn't have the money for his family. So he said to his family, if I stay here, I'll never earn the money. So I'm going to go, and he mentioned a place about 160k away, and I'm going to earn money there and then get your freedom. But secretly, he said to his wife, about a couple of weeks after I go, just take the kids and escape and make your way to this place. And so they did. And they met up together. The boys were only just 10 years old. And they made a couple of errors. They didn't change their names. And they were a little bit too easy to find. And the master sent the bounty hunters who captured them and brought them back. And this time separated the kids from the mum. The months went by, and eventually master let mum back with the kids. And she says, I have to try again. But she thinks it's too risky trying to take them all, so she made the really hard decision to leave the boys behind and just to take the girls, because it was often a tougher life for girls as slaves than it was for the boys. So she takes off and makes the trek and meets up with her husband. This time they change their names, and they dream of the day they can earn enough money. Meanwhile, the master's so mad, he sells the two boys way down deep south, 800 kilometres further south. And for years and years, the boys just dream of only one thing: freedom and seeing mum and dad again. And that consumes their thoughts, that consumes their dreams. And mum and dad continue to work year after year to try and earn the money. Eventually, the two boys get married. One of them marries someone the master doesn't agree with, and he beats him mercilessly. Eventually, as the years went by, he ended up dying from those wounds, which just left Peter, the only one from his family. And as the years continue to go by, he dreams of freedom, of just being able to hug his mum again. One day when he's in his late 40s, he gets offered a job at a bookstore in a local town. And in that bookstore were two Jewish men who, as they heard his story and as the months went by, developed a relationship with and said to him that they would end up sponsoring him and asking the master how much. He quoted a figure that was ridiculous, but they agreed to pay it. So at about the age of 50, finally, after 40 years in slavery, Peter Still comes up north and is careful, not sure who to trust, who to talk to, because even freed people were captured further north and brought back again. And as he's looking for someone to trust, he comes in contact with the chairperson of the Freed Slaves Association. And as he sits down, he starts telling his story. He doesn't know how to find his parents again. And as he starts unpacking his story, the guy listening to him writing it down puts his pen down and just looks wide-eyed at him. And finally, when the story is finished, he says to Peter Still, "We're the same family. I am actually your younger brother, because after Mum and Dad got back, they had another 14 children. And this just happened to be the youngest of them." So in this book, you can picture it, but like a movie in the mind, there is this phenomenal page where Peter meets Mum again. This incredible reunion where he just hugs his mum, because for 40 years that's what he's dreamed of. He finds out that his father has passed away. And certainly the descendants of the Still family are prominent folk in the US. However, the part of the book that touched me the most? It should have been that page, but it wasn't. Because after I had finished, I read the foreword, the thing at the front of the book. I usually read that first, but I read it last. And it's that part that choked me up. And it says this: "To the memory of Levin Still," which was the brother who died, "and of all the unransomed who like him have fallen, even while panting to be free, and who now lie in nameless, unsought graves." And that touched me, because I realized What is more sad than someone who has longed for all their lives to be ransomed and never have been? And it's at that point that I wondered if some of the prayers that I pray have been the wrong prayers. I think the things that I pray for are really important, don't get me wrong. But I realized the prayer I really needed was, God, give me a heart for the unransomed that's like yours. Give me that same desire to find the unransomed that you have. And I realize that's why you guys exist as a church. It's why Avondale College exists. It's why we exist as individuals. God sends us to find the unransomed, to find those who haven't yet found his grace, and to find that peace and that joy that you and I have, knowing that we belong to a family we never deserved to belong to, ransomed with a price that we never deserved to have paid for us. May God grant the answer to that prayer and give us that desire to find those too.